Hello everybody. This is going to be, I think, quite a short video of me going through the different variables that you need to know for research methods. As you can see on the screen, there are four variables you need to know: independent, dependent variable, extraneous variable, and finally, confounding variable as well. These are, and it's absolutely worth noting down that these variables only really exist in experiments. So when you're doing a correlation, which you'll probably do later on in the year, if this is the first time you're watching this, when you do a correlation, you have things called covariables. You have these two kind of covariables that have a relationship with each other. But with experiments, we need the IV to affect the DV, but we need to control for the EVs and the CVs as well. So there are multiple ways of teaching this. My way is just one way, particularly with confounding and extraneous variables. But let's make a start. So what do I actually mean by this term variable? So a variable is a factor in an experiment. So it's something that can be changed or varied, and they're generally used in experiments. Now, let me be clear about one thing, right? Experiments have IVs and DVs, independent variables and dependent variables. We want to see the IV have a clear effect on the DV. We want to see the IV have a clear effect on the DV. What we do with the IV is we typically split it into two or more conditions. So you can see that just here, for example. So I think I have an example which I'll go through in a second. But we want to be able to see the IV, as in these two conditions, have differing effects upon the dependent variable. Now, let's look at the IV in a bit more detail. So I just said the IV is the IV is the variable that you as a researcher manipulate. The IV is the independent variable known as the IV is what the researchers will manipulate. And what we mean by that is it's what they're in control of in the experiment. So there are typically two conditions. If you go off to uni, you'll look at more complicated IVs. But for A level, we keep it quite simple. There's two conditions. So for example, if we had the following hypothesis, alcohol significantly affects ability to remember items in a memory test, what is the IV here and what is the DV? So one way to figure out what the IV is, what is being manipulated? In this case, it would be alcohol, because alcohol is your IV. You'd split that into two conditions. One, which is where you give the participants alcohol, and the other condition is where you don't give the participants alcohol. Now, what are you actually measuring here? Because that's the DV. So if the IV is what you manipulate, the DV is what you are measuring. And in this case, you're measuring, and by the way, the DV must always be numerical. The DV is always a number. And in this case, the DV is a memory test. What's the number? Out of 20, for example. So what we've got here is essentially two conditions for your alcohol. So I'm going to operationalize this, make it a bit more specific. So we've got 10 units of alcohol consumed in 10 minutes and 0 units of alcohol consumed in 10 minutes. Now we would see how each of these conditions affects a memory test. And if there's a significant difference between them, we can then say alcohol affects memory. If you understand that, and it might be worth going back maybe 5 minutes to watch. But if you understand that, you now understand the very, very basic structure of anything scientific. We want the IV to have an effect on the DV. So as I said, the IV is what you are manipulating. So then what's the DV in a bit more detail? The DV is what you measure. Remember, the DV is always a number. Always, always, always a number. And we want to see if that number is different between the two different IVs. So, for example, in this case, the DV might be what the participant gets in the memory test out of 20. And we can see that in this one just here. Now, you got the participant number just down there. You got how many they could remember with alcohol, mostly single digits. What happened there, mate? And you've got how much they remembered without alcohol. Now, clearly, alcohol does have an effect here, but what we need to be able to determine is, and this is for much later on down the line, is this significantly higher than this? Obviously, it's higher. There's no doubt about that. But is the non-alcohol condition significantly higher than the alcohol condition? But that's another job for another day. But clearly, we can see that the IV. Clearly, we can see that the IV has had an effect upon the DV. So the non-alcohol condition scored much higher, and therefore we can say there has been a differing impact of the IV on the DV. And this is essentially the point of all experiments, regardless of what science you're talking about. Now, it says down the bottom there, in this case, we could therefore conclude that alcohol affects memory. But let's just have a look. And this is so far so easy. The next bit is harder. Is there a chance that something else had an impact on memory that wasn't the alcohol? I'll ask that again because that frames the next couple of slides quite importantly. We conclude that alcohol affects memory from this test. But is there a chance that actually it had nothing to do with alcohol? These scores had nothing to do with alcohol. They were down to some other variable that, in this case, impacted memory. For example, I don't know, Alzheimer's or tiredness or something. So here's where we look at extraneous and confounding variables. I'm going to define these separately. And this is where, as I say, some teachers teach it slightly different. I teach it this way because I think this is the simplest for students to understand, but I appreciate some teachers go about it in a different way. Extraneous and confounding variables are factors that are not the IV, yet they could still actually impact the DV. So, for example, if we go back, a participant being tired or getting good practice or having Alzheimer's, these are all things that affect the memory scores, but they've got nothing to do with alcohol in this case. So let's have a look. What is a confounding variable? Because I think confounding variable is the more complicated one. Confounding variables are variables that they are something to do with the IV. There's something to do with the IV, something to do with the experiment, but they're not specifically the IV, but they could still have an effect on the DV. So they are something to do with the study that is not the IV, but it could still have an effect upon the DV. For example, in this case, if the participant is an alcoholic. The study's about alcohol. Being an alcoholic would obviously be able to, I don't know, make you be able to remember more because you're used to being drunk. Right, but it's not specifically the IV. The IV is whether you have alcohol or not whether you are an alcoholic or not. So a confounding variable is something to do with the study that's not the IV, but it could still have an effect upon the DV. For example, not an alcohol-related one, but in this case, what happens if you are a memory champion? What happens if you are a memory champion? You've got an eidetic memory, like a photographic memory, or you just, I don't know, you spend all your time thinking of memory techniques and improving your memory. That's something to do with the study. It's not the IV, but it could still affect the DV. So a confounding variable is exactly that. An extraneous variable, on the other hand, is a variable that has got absolutely nothing to do with the study whatsoever. Not related to alcohol, not related to memory at all, but it's extra to the study. An extraneous variable is something that's got absolutely nothing to do with the study, yet it could still affect the DV. In this case, mood is often a good extraneous variable, unless mood is something you're specifically looking at. Mood is an extraneous variable most of the time. For example, if you're in a bad mood because the test is taking too long and you have to do the first condition, then you have to do the second condition, right? You might be in a bit of a bad mood. That's taking ages. Right? I thought I was going to be out of it by now. Right? Right, as you drink alcohol. Um, if you're in a bad mood, you're not going to be interested in the memory tests. You're going to perform badly, and therefore, it's got nothing to do with alcohol or memory. It's got the fact to do with you're an impatient fool. So, where might this come up? You often have to identify extraneous variables. That comes up most of the time. So confounding variable, extraneous variable, slight differences there, but that is pretty much it, to be perfectly honest with you, right? So that is the four variables you need to know. A quick summary here. You need to know IV, DV, CV, and EV. You need to know the IV has an impact on the DV. You need to know that the IV is what you manipulate and the DV is what you measure. A confounding variable is something that has got it's kind of related to the study, but it's not specifically the IV, yet it could still affect the DV. Whereas an extraneous variable is something that has got absolutely nothing to do with the experiment, yet again, it could still have an effect on the DV. Quite a short, sharp one today, pretty straightforward. You do need to know these four variables. You will be asked about them. Peace out.